Thank you very much to all of you for coming this afternoon. We'd like to start because we only have about an hour, and we had hoped that there would be more people here. This is the second of the Vice-Chancellor's meetings with students on the campus. Yesterday we had a meeting at the Health Sciences faculty. This is the second one, and tomorrow night we will have one in the residences. The purpose of this meeting is essentially to give the Vice-Chancellor an opportunity to talk to the new proposals for our admissions policy. So what is going to happen is that he will speak for about 35 minutes or so, and we'll throw the discussion open to the floor at that particular point. Allow me, however, just to give you some sense of where we are in this process with these proposals. So these proposals have been a long time in coming. We've been spending the last 3 or 4 years trying to develop models to come up with alternative ways of dealing with our admissions processes. In the course of last year, we developed the models which the Vice-Chancellor will essentially talk to, and we took these models through the faculties. So all of the faculties have been in a robust discussion with what you see here. And we got to the point where we were about to take the proposals to Senate, which is the most senior academic committee on the campus. And at that point, it became clear to us that the process was possibly going too fast, and that there had not been sufficient engagement with the students around all of that, and we committed ourselves to a process of giving students a stronger opportunity to express their opinions. This is what this now is all about. This is an attempt to correct that anxiety. So we don't have terribly much time, so I'm going to hand straight over to our Vice-Chancellor. Thank you very much, Max.
Thank you, Professor Sidney. So we'll try to keep my presentation to 30 minutes, so we've got plenty of time to take questions and answers. And also to say that there are 2 important opportunities for students to have formal input into the process. There's a Senate meeting at which students are well represented, and there's a council meeting at which SRC is represented. And both of those are opportunities to make amendments and suggestions. And prior to that, and that's really what I'm hoping will happen, because it's hard to make amendments in those formal structures, there's the presentations, the talks will be on the website, and there'll be an opportunity for you to send written submissions, as well as, of course, engaging in the conversations here. And all of that can lead to improvements in what we're doing. The overview of what I want to cover is firstly to start with the background to the current policy, because I think it's only really makes sense to talk about the change if you understand the background. And one of the things I've realized is that not many people understand the current policy. And so we're going to go through that quickly. And then I'm going to say something about what its strengths and weaknesses have been, what its problems have been. Then we're going to look at the new proposals, which is called a hybrid model, because it combines a number of different factors into the selection process, and then look at the implications of the hybrid model. So our current policy has 2 phases, and the future policy also has 2 phases. Stage 1 is something that happens around about April each year, and it's a process we go through with all the faculties, where we set targets, diversity targets, for the following year's admission. And we do that based on our current numbers, on some knowledge about how many students are coming out of the school system with different subject choices. So there's no point in setting a very high target for black students in science who need maths and at a certain level, if we know that there are or very few students, or not enough students coming through the system with that. So we take into account the pool of applicants from year to year, and we set what we would call stretch targets. We look at where we are now and we say what's a reasonable growth in the proportion of black, coloured, Indian or Chinese students, and we also take into account international and white. We also set a minimum threshold, which is usually based on a combination of National Senior Certificate results and National Benchmark Test results. All our applicants have to write NBTs. Not every faculty uses the NBTs, some do, but essentially this is a minimum threshold below which we think people have not got a good chance, have got a less than 50% chance of completing their degree, because there just isn't, the schooling has just not been good enough. So we don't, and we never go below that, and we set that in advance, and we do research to say what is the pass rate this year and in previous years based on people's school results. So that's a policy level. Then stage 2 is the process, the implementation, the procedure, and that happens once we get the applications in. And it starts with the application form, where we ask students to self-identify with a race category, with one of the apartheid race categories. I use inverted commas to signal that we're not saying that there are real races or that there are 4 races, but what we're saying is that under apartheid, the populated people were categorized into legally defined categories, which were called races, and those are the categories: African, coloured, Indian, Chinese, and white. And those categories, we ask the applicants to classify themselves, and then once we have the applications, we then put all the students within one category into a different basket. So we'll have a basket for African students, a basket for coloured students, a basket for Indian, white, etc. The white basket is the open basket, and it includes anyone who hasn't classified themselves, and it also includes the international students. And then within each basket, we rank the students from top to bottom according to their school scores or their NBT scores, whatever we're using, and we then take the top of that basket, depending on what the target is. So if in a particular program, let's just say it's a program that has 100 students, 100 places, normally we make twice as many offers, because we know that quite a lot of people don't take up the offers. They apply to many universities, they may go somewhere else. So we'll make 200 offers. So we send out 200 offers, and if our aim was to have 25% coloured in that group, in other words, we'll send out 50 offers to coloured students, and we do that by selecting the top 50 coloured students in the basket of coloured applicants for that program. So that's how it works at the moment, how it's supposed to work. The current policy has served us well over the last 15 years or so, and it has a number of advantages. It's relatively easy to control the targets because people are in their categories, and so we can get the number that we want for a target. Secondly, we've made good progress in most areas. So we've had a growing number of our diversity has improved progressively over the years. So it's a policy that has generally worked reasonably well, although there are areas where it hasn't, not as much. But I'm not here so much to discuss the actual numbers, it's more the principles. Historically, it was a reasonably fair policy. Fair in the sense that race was really a measure. The reason we had this policy was in recognition of the fact that from 1994 onwards, when this policy was being used, was that the students, black students, were the immediate victims. Their circumstances in terms of the schools they went to, their home backgrounds, all of the life opportunities they had were a direct consequence of apartheid. And being black was a proxy for having experienced all of that disadvantage and discrimination. It was almost a one-to-one relationship. If you were black, you were likely to be poor, you had been to a poor school, rural or township school, your parents were relatively uneducated by comparison to white students. Your ability to perform well in a school system, in an exam system, was going to be compromised. So simply to evaluate you on the basis of your marks and to select students into the university simply by looking at their marks would have been hugely unfair, because it would not have taken into account the fact that black students, 95%, would have had lower marks, not because they weren't talented or didn't have any advantages, but because they were still suffering the consequences of apartheid discrimination. And so, as I say, black people were mostly poor, mostly had poor schooling compared to white students, and so being black was a very accurate marker of that disadvantage. Most black students would not have been admitted in the absence of affirmative action, so it was the only way in which one could increase the number of black students was by selecting them because they were black. And the system worked, the policy worked to do that. And finally, the system helped us select the top students because, as I mentioned, the marks were not a reflection of talent and opportunity. Because if you came out of a different school system, you would have much lower marks. But if you were the top student in that school system, then you were probably comparable to the top students in a different school system. So the top black students coming out of township schools have the same talent and ability as the top black students, the top white students in suburban or Model C or private schools. So what the system did is it helped us select the very top students, top potential across the country through those race-based baskets. But there have also been some problems, and these problems have been growing over the last 15 years, and it's really the change of circumstances, the change in societies to some extent, and the fact that we think we can do things better now, that is the reason to reconsider the policy. I don't want to labor the points too much, I don't want to put proportions on them. Some people will say these are more important, and some will argue that they're less important. But here are just a range of issues. Some people, and increasingly, don't want to identify with a race group. Some are offended by the idea that they should have to classify themselves as in one race group or another. Some feel that they don't fit into race groups. It's not part of their identity. Increasingly, post-1994, we have got children born of marriages and partnerships which do not at all fit the traditional categories, and so the classification systems don't work. And some, for political and ideological reasons, feel that it's inappropriate in a society that is moving towards non-racialism or wants to become a more non-racial society to view everyone, yourself and everyone else, through racial lenses. And some of you will have been to, no, you probably won't have been, but if you go around to the schools, I go to the schools, Prof. Celine goes to the schools in the local communities, even disadvantaged schools, where the principals are saying to their students, do not put your race down on the application form. They're challenging them not to do that because they're saying that that is ideologically, politically dangerous and inappropriate, even though they could benefit from it. Some of you will know the late Neville Alexander, who par excellence represented that view. Then there's a problem of people misrepresenting their race. Increasingly, we have people saying, well, you know, I could be Indian, I could be coloured, I'm going to call myself coloured. Or I could be coloured, I could be African. I can trace some African blood in my ancestors 2 generations back, I'm going to classify myself African. We have no mechanism for checking or verifying or validating that, and we don't want to be in the position of looking at someone and saying, no, you're not coloured, you're actually Indian. We don't want to do that. It wasn't a significant problem, it's becoming more of a problem. Every year we get complaints from parents who say, this child from my daughter's class has been accepted and had lower marks than my daughter. We know the family very well. We're both Indian families. This other family must have classified themselves as coloured, and we look it up, and indeed that's the case. And then we have to go through some sort of process of trying to say, well, what do we do about this? Then there's perhaps much more importantly, and I should have reversed the order of the bullet points because these are the more important points. There's been a significant change to the access to schools. So whereas in the past there were very few black students who were going to good schools, and therefore the only black students we would get, in black and coloured, sometimes Indian as well, would have been through a race-based affirmative action. Today we have many black students coming from good schools, and we can select roughly half of all black students coming into UCT now are coming from what I would call middle-class schools, Model C and private schools, and do not need any affirmative action in order to get in. So there are other ways in which we can achieve the diversity which are not entirely dependent on race classification. And we need to take note of that. And some of those students also say to us that they resent the implications that they have got in here through allowances being made for the fact that they were black through affirmative action, when actually they did just as well. They may have been the best students in their class, or may have been in the top 10 or 20%, and they know that they got in just on the basis of their own performance, not through some additional assistance by being black. And so we think that the dynamics on the campus and the issues of self-esteem and of how people view each other on the campus could be improved, could be, if it is the case that many black students can be admitted without having to be classified as black in order to do so. And then there's also an increasing unfairness that's arisen, which is that because we have quite a lot of students, black and white now, who have, to all intents and purposes, come from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, similar wealth, similar schools, 12 years in the same schools, play sport together, socialize together, party together, and then all of a sudden they get to grade 12 and they have to apply for UCT. By declaring race, they know that the one is going to have a significant disadvantage relative to the other, or a significant advantage. And so those are things that are creating, and that's been the source of much of the newspaper criticism, creating unfairness. But the principles, again, tell us that this is an issue. Fundamentally, the debate is around how to move away from a racial society. How do we de-racialize South Africa? It's a goal that I think we all share in the long term, and there are two fundamentally different approaches. One says you should deny race, you should be race blind, you should give no preferential treatment based on race, and the other says we should use race as the mechanism for redress, as the basis for affirmative action, and it's not primarily about individual fairness or unfairness, it's about communities and community fairness or unfairness. And I think what's happening in this review of policy is that UCT, up until now, has been firmly and entirely within the second group, where we saw using race as not just legitimate but necessary, and that it was and that we should use only race. And we are shifting to say we think that the society, the pool of students and other things have changed a bit. We don't think we can move to the first category, and we don't think that's appropriate because race and racism still exists. Race inequality is huge. We have not achieved the diversity we want to achieve, but that we can have a hybrid model which, in addition to race, looks at other factors and would address those concerns that I highlighted. So the hybrid model consists of three bands or three groups of students who are selected in. The first is aimed at meeting our goal of having the very best, highest achieving students in the country coming to UCT, regardless of disadvantage, regardless of race, regardless of anything. We just want to have the best students here. We need to limit how many that is in a class, because if we allow that group to become too large, then it will skew the race and demographic profile, because it's still the case that most of those students will be white, most of them will come from private schools, they'll be wealthy, they'll come from upper middle class communities, but there will be, of course, black students, colored students, Indian students in that group as well. We just don't want to lose that altogether. So one group of students that is selected is just based on marks, and roughly for the university as a whole we think that would be about 15% of the class. And it's NSC and NBT, National Benchmark Test. The second band is saying there are a lot of very talented students, but their marks aren't that high because of their disadvantaged background. Or they may not actually be a disadvantaged background, but they have some disadvantage. And if we can modify their marks, if we can increase their marks to compensate for that disadvantage, then we can not only select the very best students, rather than losing them because their marks are low, but we can adjust for the real disadvantage instead of only using race as a proxy for disadvantage. So for example, if you had two students both getting 70% and one comes from a township school and one comes from a Model C school, suburban school, it's very likely that the student with 70% from the township school is actually a much better student, much more talented, because they have overcome a whole lot of obstacles to get the same mark. So if we can rather up that mark to say 77 by weighting it upwards based on the disadvantage, then not only is that a fairer competition, that person is now competing with students who have 77% from a privileged school, but we can also make sure that we get the best of those students in rather than losing those students. And in the modelling we've done, it seems to us that we can fill about 60% of a class, and that means we're up to now 75% altogether. Now, much of that band B brings in black students, because many more black students come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and so they are getting the advantage of those extra weights and those extra points, and they are therefore becoming more competitive, and they're being selected. But the distribution, and as you can imagine, most black kids are still going to township schools, not to urban schools. So the distribution is not yet sufficient that we could rely just on those direct measures of disadvantage. And we still have to have that third band, which is race-based admissions, race-based selection, where we use our current policy and we put students into baskets by race, and we select from that basket, recognizing that that is A, necessary in order to achieve the diversity, and fair because race and racism is still a huge factor. And so the policy, the new policy, still has those two elements, those two stages. The first stage, which is setting targets, and those targets are still determined, calculated or measured using race as the targets that we're trying to achieve. We're not in a position to say we have targets for disadvantage or socioeconomic diversity. We use race targets, so it's still, in that sense, a race-informed policy. But the mechanism, the stage two, we are adding to race two other ways, two other components to select students. So, just very briefly, how do we measure disadvantage? We've done a number of studies, statistical studies to measure this, and the things that we've chosen, which is also taken into account what can be reliable information, is the quality of the school that you went to, the education of your mother, father, and grandparents, the language spoken, your mother tongue, or language spoken at home, financial indicators such as whether the family is dependent on a social graft. And the disadvantage index for that middle band is designed through two components. There's a home background and a school background. So if you've been to a disadvantaged school, you can get up to the maximum number of points, 10 points from the school, and then there's no need to look further at the home background. But if you've been to an advantaged school, then you may still come from a disadvantaged background or relatively disadvantaged background, because you might, for example, have been the child of a domestic worker going to Westerford, or you might have been the child of parents who have not had university education going to Bishops. And we recognize that there is a legacy, a transgenerational sort of hangover effect of educational disadvantage. It's not just the school you go to, it's not just your wealth and income, it's also things like what we call cultural capital, your parents' education, your grandparents' education. Those factors also have effect. So that disadvantage may give you extra points even if you're at a good school. And then those two things come together, and so the index is a value between 0 and 10, and that's a percentage. And so the maximum increase would be 10%. So if you had 70% out of your NSC and you have the maximum disadvantage index, then your score goes up to 77%. In the faculty of health sciences, it's actually a 20% weighting. So it would go from 70 to 84%. I won't go into detail about why it's slightly different, but you can see that it's a very big jump based on the disadvantage from 70 to 84. There would be thousands of people on the list between the person who's ranked 70 and the person who's ranked 83, and that disadvantage rating will make a significant difference. But when we apply it and test it, the model, I've just chosen 2 faculties to give you some example of how it works out, but also how different it gets applied in different faculties. So, in the first column, which is a BCom degree, we find that the distribution, the cutoff marks for the BCom degree and the marks that you have to get in are not nearly as competitive as for medicine. So people getting 70%, 75, 80, 85, most of them will be accepted into a BCom degree. And when you look at the distribution of marks from black students, you find that there are many black students who are getting 70, 75, 80. The result is that in that first band that you take just based on marks, in this case it would be all those above 80%, there are actually lots of black students in that, and therefore that band can be a bit bigger. It can be 32% of the class can be selected in that band. Compared to in medicine, where the cutoff is around 94%, and above 94, and even down to say 90, there will be very few black students. If you allow that band to go down to the 90% cutoff, you would nearly fill the class, but it would all be white students. So that band has to be much smaller. You still want some of the top students, but it's a band that's adjusted, taking account of the competitiveness of the program and the profile of the students applying. The second band, the disadvantage rated score in BCom, is about 55%. And what we find is that between those 2 bands, A and B in BCom, we can select 87% of the class, and in that 87% of the class we will get very close to our diversity targets. Most of the students selected in band B, many of them will be black students because of that disadvantage rating. But in both band A and band B, there's no mention of race actually. So band A and band B are race blind, because we're only using the disadvantage scores there. And so what that means is that for BCom, 87% of the class is actually selected without race classification. But to reach the targets and to stretch the targets, we still have band C, and that would be about 13% in the case of BCom, and that would mostly be coloured and African students, because they are short in terms of our targets in that. Medicine, you can see, is very different. Because the cutoffs are so high and there are far fewer black students from disadvantaged backgrounds in those top marks, only 42% of the class can be selected without regard to race, and 58% has to be selected using the race baskets in order to achieve the diversity that we want. So the model is hybrid because it's using marks, socioeconomic disadvantage, educational disadvantage, and race, using all 3. It's very flexible, and each program would have its own particular combination, and it allows us very effectively to reach the targets we want. And the targets will progressively increase the number of black students year on year. But what it also does, and this is what I want to just come to some of the advantages, it means that a substantial portion of the class is selected on a race-blind way, and therefore there is no need for race classification for most of them, and that gets us over some of the issues which many applicants and students have about classifying themselves, and if they don't want to, most would not be disadvantaged. Of course, if they want to take advantage of the race basket, they would have to classify themselves. It's flexible, I've mentioned that. It selects the top students from disadvantaged backgrounds, black and white, who would not have been selected. I want to just explain this point, that as the university, as more and more black students have been going to good schools, because we've only been selecting in our current policy within, let's say, the black basket, most of the students we select are coming from the good schools to reach our targets. The students from disadvantaged schools, black students from disadvantaged schools, were generally not being selected as quickly, but they may have been the best students. They've achieved the top of their group within very disadvantaged backgrounds. But actually, because they were grouped with all other black students, they weren't getting selected. The same applied to the white students. White students were all selected together, only a few were being selected from the very top of the group, and so any student who didn't go to a really good school, white student, wasn't getting selected, but they may have been the most talented students. What this does is, by taking account of disadvantage, educational, school, etc., it's as if it's creating a new basket of disadvantaged students and taking the top students from the disadvantaged background. And so that's why that third bullet point says that we think this helps us in selecting the top students from all groups. It also increases the socio-economic diversity of the class. So historically, we've only aimed at race diversity. Now, we didn't have to be explicit about socioeconomic diversity in the past because, by definition, if you had race diversity, you would have had socioeconomic diversity. Most black people coming into university were coming from poor backgrounds. But that has changed. And so we have become a less diverse university. And roughly half of our black students are coming from middle-class backgrounds now. So we have actually lost some of that diversity, and this helps re-establish that socioeconomic diversity. Also, it establishes it for white and Indian and other groups, not just for black students. And then we believe it's fairer to students who in fact may be equally privileged. And finally, I just want to leave you with two thoughts in the last slide. And that is to try to dispel the myths which I believe are leading to a very heated debate around the wrong issues or based on a misunderstanding. The policy has been criticized from some quarters as having sold out because it's discarded race, that it's no longer a race-based policy, and that people say things like, race is still important in society, it's still a highly unequal society based on race. Although it's 20 years post-apartheid, race still defines, by and large, the way society is structured. We agree with all of that. And we also agree that we've got a long way to go before we have a fully transformed university and transformed student body. But this is not discarding race, the proposed policies. The targets and the monitoring continue to be based on race. Race remains the basis for selecting a proportion of the class, and we are supplementing race rather than discarding it. We are supplementing it with disadvantage, weighted, I should say, merit. And then the second myth that we need to dispel is that we are not decreasing the number of black and coloured students. In fact, the opposite. And we've shown in the modelling, and we will show in reality, that this gives us a sharper tool to achieve the diversity targets that we want to achieve through that band C, and we believe that the number of black and coloured students will be able to increase. And so I'll stop there and hand over to take questions of clarification and any other points that we'd like to make.
Okay, so we've got to watch the time here. We have to be out of here by 2 o'clock. There's a class coming in here too. So, yes, that's excellent. So, Colin, please, go on.
Thank you for the presentation, Dr. Price. We note the presentation that you made concerning the proposed policy. There is one fundamental problem I have with the university's approach to admissions policy, and especially pertaining to the targeting, especially pertaining to the diversity targeting. Well, so what is currently happening, even in the current policy and in the proposed model, is that the university sets targets pertaining to other factors, blah, blah, blah. But what happens when the students are students from historically disadvantaged backgrounds, which the university classifies as historically apartheid categories? Those students exceed the university's targets. Does the university take those students? Because if it does not, then the university won't be transforming at a radical pace at which the basic education sector is heading towards. It doesn't matter whether a student is coming from a historically advantaged background, what you would classify as currently advantaged background. However, there are certain aspects of the admissions targeting that are not allowing those students who actually qualify for this individual courses that inhibits radical transformation, especially pertaining to demographics and institution. Now, number one, my question is based on this: is the university prepared, even if they have met the targets, to further increase the targets of people from historically disadvantaged backgrounds, meaning that people from black, colored, Indian backgrounds, and if the policy does not make preference or make ways towards that, then how is this policy better than the current policy, especially pertaining that we're going to sustain the current growth rates, especially pertaining to race?
Okay. I'll answer, if you think I'm going on too long, just say so we can make sure there's plenty of time. The target, so I just want to break it into two parts of the answer. The first is this, that we have some targets. Those targets would not exceed the population distribution. So in the case of Indian students, in almost every faculty, there may be one exception, we now have more Indian students at the university than would be represented in the national or the Western Cape population. So in that sense, we would not continue to increase and offer more places to Indian students. Indian students now, to a large extent, fall into the same category as white students. There is no longer a need or a justification for affirmative action if our goal is a broadly representative population. For coloured and African students, where we are still behind those targets, the improvement tends to be on an annual iterative cycle, and it's because when we start getting applications in from June, we have to start making early offers. So we have an expectation. Let's just say that, to simplify it, was going to be 20% Indian, 25% white, 25% coloured, 25% African, just so that we're using the figures. We need to start making offers very early on, and we do that, and we go up to the limit. So we wouldn't make more than 25% white offers, because that would close out space for coloured and African. But we do make those offers early, so we don't lose those students to other universities. If we then find, when the matric is written, that there turn out to be more eligible coloured and African students that we had, it may be too late to make extra offers, because we've already made those offers to Indian and white students, so we can't increase our total numbers. We have a cap, obviously, on how many offers we make. But we use that information the next year to change the target. So we say, okay, now we realize that there's actually many more applicants who are eligible, so we adjust the targets the next April, and then that will necessarily mean that the white targets and Indian targets will come down a bit. And so there's a slight delay sometimes. So if you looked at our figures from last year, you would be able to point to some coloured students that didn't get in, even though they exceeded the minimum, and even though we didn't reach, we did, let's say we reached our target. But next year, or this year when we set the targets, it'll be adapted to take it into account.
Okay, I'm going to give that side a chance.
I'll just take 4 questions.
Yes, okay. Yes, all right. So let's give you all. Who else would like to ask a question? Please, let's just see how many people would like to ask questions. Okay, so we may not be able to get all of you. If you make long statements, so try and make your questions as brief as possible, please. Okay.
Sorry to sidetrack a bit, but my question is more to do with why does the new admissions policy not say anything about international students? Because it seems that at UCT, we have a situation where people are almost underqualified. Because I had a situation where I did A-levels, I was educated in South Africa, but I didn't have to write MBTs because I'm not South African. But a South African who did A-levels had to write MBTs. But another international student who did another system would not have to write MBTs. For me, that's sort of unfair, because although it's a superior system, it doesn't mean you know anything about matric. Like, MBTs are based on the South African schooling system. So you have a situation where people are really great at A levels, but then they have to write MBTs, and that really brings down their mark because they don't know nothing about it, they're not educated about it. Secondly, in terms of admissions, it seems
No,
like...
no, you only one question. So just for democracy's sake here, to give everybody a chance, because there are lots of people who are wanting to ask. Okay? So sorry, please. So just one question, please. One question. Ramabi.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My question is really, it's a quick one. In one of the slides, you mentioned that we are not decreasing the number of black students and color students, so to say. In fact, the opposite is actually occurring. Now, I'm asking, how is that the case? Because I'm not necessarily seeing that. Like, for example, in Band B, a white student will be classified as disadvantaged if they come from a poor school, or if maybe their parents are not really socio-economically, okay, so to say. So I'm not seeing the increment this policy will bring to colored and black students. How is that the case?
Okay, so let it go on the side, Colin. Just for equity's sake.
Okay, thank
Quickly,
you.
Tom.
I would like to know how much is the hybrid model influenced by the requirements in South African job market, like the transformation that needs to happen there. How is this informed by that?
Okay, thank
I
you.
don't understand anything.
So our job market demands influencing the way in which we're setting what these targets are all about. Yes? Please go ahead.
Thank you. My question is about a point that said that in using race, black students feel that they have a low self-esteem because they've entered the university via race. And I just wanted to find out, as far as I know in UCT, we don't have an exam light or an affirmative action exam that's separate for people who entered here using the affirmative action policy. So I want to find out how do they come to this conclusion, and is the race the only way we get in, and is nothing else considered that would make us feel that we're stupid because we entered using affirmative action? Thank you.
Okay. Over there. Just pass it to behind you, please.
I wanted to ask about the do you support structures get designed in tandem with new admissions policies? Because particularly with Band C students, coming to university is a vastly different environment, and it does really make, in terms of the quality of diversity, if you admit people but they end up dropping out because they aren't support structures together.
Sure. Okay. This way, please, Connie.
I would like to commend you for taking some time to consult. My question is, how much consultation have you done with maybe the corporate world and people out there about the implications of this policy? Because there is also, I think, the danger that putting much emphasis on race would also affect maybe those who have benefited from this. Like when they go out to work, they might continue to be classified, or maybe their performance measured along those lines, to see a black student from UCT and a white student from UCT being measured differently in terms of performance when they enter the corporate world. So I would like to also ask them how much consultation have you done so that
Got it? Okay.
I just want to ask the Vice-Chancellor.
Sorry, where's that?
Just in terms of your argument about the submission with the first band, the A band, about getting the larger majority, say 1 year, the larger majority of students who were accepted in the A band are white students. And if it is the case, the following year you'll cap the amount of white students you bring in. Say not enough black students qualify. Does that mean that you're going to close off that white band for that year? Or you're going to accept more white students? Because then it doesn't make sense that the 1 year you limit the amount of white students that get in when you don't reach your mark of 15%. And then again, if you do accept, then that means that we're not going to reach our race quota as expected.
Dr. Vice-Chancellor, I just want to find out, because this new proposal that you're giving us here, you're putting a lot of emphasis on the disadvantaged students from red backgrounds, language, and everything like that. And Band A and Band B indicate that specifically. My question is that isn't this new proposal now punishing the middle class black students? Because yes, of course, we have seen over the years that this policy has been giving them a lot of advantage. But for the first time with going forward this new proposal now, we're clearly punishing the middle class black students. And so is that discriminative against them? Can you please elaborate on that?
Thank you. Dr. Price, in the Band B, is it purely a proxy for race, so using disadvantage as a proxy for race, or is that also informed by some kind of measure of disadvantage and quantifying its effects?
Okay. Last question here in the front. Last one. Okay.
I suppose my question sort of echoes the questions of others. I want to find out specifically what the requirements are of the disadvantaged band, because my concern is that if the requirements, especially socioeconomically, are too high, this may reduce the number of students of color actually being accepted into the university.
Last question.
I think everyone can hear me.
No. Use it.
Thanks. I won't really speak on the arguments which are raised because we can't argue the same thing, Dr. Price, for more than 6 years with you and you, Professor Craig. There's no way. But I think I'll just ask, since we are asked to ask one question, on one which I think is raised as new, that it is offensive to classify your race. And I want you to be honest with this. Do you really think if it is offending to classify your race, classifying your parents' education is less offending? Classifying whether you are a recipient of a social grant is less offending than just saying you are black or you are colored? Does it really make sense to you that would be less offending than just saying you are black? Because I'll tell you, all of you are here, this is not something new. This is a debate that has run for more than 6 years on the same arguments. On the same arguments, yet we're still sitting here listening to the very same things and we won't, it's fine. Like advocate, we're not going anywhere. We're going to be here, even tomorrow will be there. But I just want to ask, which do you really think is less offending? Classifying your race or saying your parent really went to school around?
Got it. Okay. Right, so I don't know how you're going to do that in 10 minutes.
A lot of questions. No, that's great, but that's good. I'll do my best. The question about international students. The international students, I think there were two parts to this. The policy basically includes international students in the open category. So they would compete now in bands, in the band A, which is open. We would not weight international students for disadvantage, and they would not, so they would not be included in band B, they wouldn't be included in band C. So they're just competing on marks as other open students are. There is a cap to some extent in some programs on international students. We have a broad, we haven't had to impose it in general, but so we do keep an eye on that and keep a separate eye on that, because when we take in international students, it is at the expense of South African students, and we've broadly got a target of going up to, or not going above 20% of the university international. So they don't really fit in easily. The second part of your question was about what exam system should they use. I don't know enough actually about who has to write the NBTs or not. I would have, do you want to comment on that part?
Well, for the moment, we're not international students don't have to write the NBTs. I mean, so this complication of South African students with international grade 12, I don't know. That's a different category.
We'll follow it up. I'm not clear about that. We'll follow up and we'll find out about. In general, the reason for the NBTs is twofold, and I just want to say why international students haven't had to in the past. One is because we haven't been really trusting of the matric marks, because they fluctuate up and down, and there's sometimes we think a bit of political interference in pushing up the pass rates, and we don't really know sometimes what it means, and the exams change from one system to another. So the NBTs gave us a more stable calibration, a more reliable measure. Whereas I think we have good confidence in the A levels, for example, and so we know what an A level means, and if someone comes with that, we know whether they're going to pass or not and what they need. So that's why we haven't required it in the past. And secondly, we use the NBTs to place students who are not strong, who've got into academic development programs. And we would not normally be taking international students with A levels or other things who are not strong. So we wouldn't take them they don't need to be placed, then they just wouldn't get in. Let me talk about that ADP. The question was, do we have support structures if we're going to be drawing in the students who may be more disadvantaged because of the disadvantage rating? And I think we have. We've built up a strong support. That doesn't mean we get it right all the time, but the NBT test, which everyone writes, is designed in part to help us place students on extended programs, sometimes for an extra year, on augmented programs. There are a whole lot of things which the first year experience does, tutors, mentors, writing courses. So all of that is aimed to improve the success rate. The important thing is that the final exams are the same. There's no differentiation, and that comes to the question that someone asked about, are the employers going to differentiate between black and white students regarding black students as not as good as white students? I don't think nothing in this policy would change that, because we've always had an affirmative action policy. We've always been taking in black students from disadvantaged schools with weaker school marks, but we haven't changed the exit standards. It does mean that many more black students have dropped out along the way than white students, because we're not successful in getting everyone, in making good a 12 years of schooling deficit in the 2 or 3 years of academic development programs. And we've tried to limit the risk for the students themselves and for the fees and everything else. But I think we're reasonably confident that the quality of graduates is regarded as standard and not racially differentiated. And certainly we don't in terms of exit exams. The question about Rowena asked the question about what is it in the model that ensures or that allows us to increase numbers of black and coloured students, and how do we ensure that they don't decline? And that's really through the band C. So because the band C is a band that allows us to allocate people from specific race baskets. And so when we've looked at and filled it from band A and B, and we can see what the numbers are, then we can say, okay, we're short of this number to reach a target, and we just fill that from the basket of black students or coloured students in band C. And it gives us quite a direct control over that in ways that we haven't had as easily from the other. The only real risk is that we don't know what the uptake is. So we make offers, but we can't be sure that the same proportion of band A will take up the offers as band B or band C or coloured or Indian. We know, for example, that people from the town, a lot of our Indian students apply from the town. The take-up rate is only about 15% of the offers that we make, whereas for white students from Western Cape, the take-up rate is 80%. So we have to calculate into all these over-offer rates guesses about the take-up rate. So sometimes we may get it wrong, but we think that the band C allows us to bring in more students of any particular group. I still didn't fully understand the job market question, but we don't really take it into account. All I would say we do is through our career services, we get feedback on employment. We do surveys of graduate unemployment or graduate employment. The last survey we did showed that UCT graduates, 18 months after graduating, only 5% who want to have jobs are not employed. So and that is about the best in the country at the moment. And we only did the 4 Western Cape universities, so we can't be sure. But that's the kind of feedback we look for. And it's also about curriculum redesign and other things, but not really about admissions policy. Do students have lower self-esteem? It was a good question. I think the question was, what do we base this on? Who asked that question? Sorry, who asked the question? So what it's based on is, you asked, is there an exam light? And I presume you're referring to exams in the university. So I don't think there is. We're not worried about that. The reason for the self-esteem issue is this, that basically everyone knows that if you're in medicine and you're a white student, you had to get above 92% in your school exams to get in. If you're a black student, you could have got about 92%. There would only have been 1 or 2 in that category. Most would have been between 70 and 80%. So the black students who were admitted with about 20% lower school marks. And that's where the issue of I'm regarded as only having got in because I'm black, not because I was good enough. And that then, in fact, is maybe true for some, although it doesn't, not that they weren't good enough, it's that they got those marks in spite of after having overcome huge obstacles. So we think those students are equally good as the students who get 90% because they're at the top of their grade. So we don't have concerns, and we know that they'll catch up, and we give them the ADP. But that's what I was referring to about the basis on which students are admitted. Then I've already addressed the question of support structures. I've addressed the question of consultations with the corporate world, so black and white graduates. Then I was misunderstood, the question right at the back about Band A changing from year to year and if not enough white students. The way you phrased the question tells me that I didn't explain that at all clearly. Band A is based on marks, and what I'm saying is that we would keep that to be quite a small band. We would know roughly how many black and white students are going to come in through that band, and so that determines how big the band is, because we've got to leave enough space for the other bands. But we would, if we found that there were not enough, let's just say we found that there were not enough black and coloured students to reach our target, after we had filled Band A and Band B, and then also topped up that group from Band C, which is the race-based basket, if we still didn't find that there were enough students above the minimum threshold from a particular basket, then certainly we top it up from the other baskets. And that's what we've always done. So quite often we have a target which is not achieved, and we don't leave the class empty. We fill up the class, but we fill it from the other baskets if we don't have enough students above the threshold. The year-to-year change is really a result. What I was saying there was that if we find that there are more applicants than we had expected, and we could have set a higher diversity target than we did set, then we will change the target for the following year. That was the reference to changing from year to year. The question about disadvantage, now, does it discriminate against the middle class? Middle classes. The middle class black students come into the class through all 3 bands. I don't remember who asked the question, I just want to look at you. Yeah. The middle class black students come in through all 3 bands. Some of those middle class students are going to be the top students in Band A. They're at good schools, good backgrounds, really excellent results. And if you looked at that BCom example, where 35% of the class is selected in Band A, there are roughly equal numbers of black and white students in that first group, and they are mostly middle class students. In Band B, although there is a disadvantage weighting, it's only a weighting. So many of the students coming in Band B might only have a disadvantage point of, I said it could go from 0 to 10. They may have a disadvantage score of 1, 2, or 3, because perhaps it was a grandparent who didn't have a university education, or perhaps it was a mother and father, but they're still middle class. They've been put into jobs and have gone to schools that are effectively middle class. Even if they had no disadvantage, they would still be there, but they would be competing with students who had lower marks but were disadvantaged. But many of the students who get in that Band B are getting in without disadvantage, because all of the students are ranked, and the disadvantage just pushes you higher up the ranking. But many of them are still middle class and will get in through that band. And then Band C, which is the band selected only on the basis of race baskets, may well bringing in middle class black students. So if, let's say, you were a student at Westerford, a black student at Westerford, you weren't disadvantaged, you're middle class, you didn't therefore get the disadvantage weighting, and so you didn't get pushed up in the competition, and your marks were not good enough to get in Band A or Band B, you are now probably right at the top of the Band C of black students. you're still there. And so as we fill that top up to achieve the targets we want of black students, the first students selected are going to be those middle class black students. So that's a very important factor. One of the concerns we had when we were developing this policy in the beginning was we were concerned about a bimodal distribution on the campus. Are you pointing to me and say there's a class weighting?
No class weighting, actually.
No class weighting. We were concerned that one of the risks of this would be that you'd have white students who get in mainly through Band A and black students who get in mainly through Band B, and that they're largely disadvantaged, and that their performance at university for the first couple of years would be very different, and that we would reproduce on the campus a racial stereotype where black students would all be disadvantaged and white students would all be very privileged. And we're anxious not to let that happen. So we definitely need to make sure that those middle class black students are also selected in, and that happens, as I say, through all three bands. And we've modeled that. When we've tested this, we've taken actual applicants both for 2013 and for 2014. We had asked these questions in the application forms, even though we didn't use it to actually select them, but we were using it for research. We've created disability ratings for all the students who applied, and then we've looked at who would have got in and who wouldn't have got in. And we can see that we've got a good spread. I'll just finish answering, and then if there are more rounds of questions, we can. And then the last question that I have here, I think, is, no, two more questions. Is Band B, is disadvantage a proxy for race? It's not a direct proxy for race because there are white students who will benefit from that disadvantaged score as well. For example, so if white students have not been to good schools or have parents who haven't, who are first generation, the student would be a first generation student at university, they will get some points and they will benefit. But it is a very highly correlated. So when we look at what proportion of these disadvantaged students are black, it's around 80%. It depends on different programs, but it's around 80%. So it is a close proxy because schooling is such an important thing in that disadvantage factor, and schools are still often racially segregated, so the poor schools are almost all black schools or coloured schools. And so it is a proxy. Then the question is that a good or a bad thing? And we don't think that's a bad thing because our target is to have more black students. We are trying to get that diversity. What we are trying to move away from is race classification. So if we can achieve that diversity without requiring everyone to use race classification, then we think that that's still an improvement. It takes us in the direction we want to go. And that probably brings me to the last question, which is some people have no problem, many people, probably the majority, have no problem classifying themselves by race, but they may have a problem saying that their parents, or what their socioeconomic status is, or what their parents' education is. I think it's a valid point. It's not something we've tested. We can say that our current financial aid system, the NSFAS, requires quite a lot of that information anyway. In other words, students have to say what their income is and provide a whole lot of evidence in order to be eligible for NSFAS, and that hasn't produced problems that we're aware of, but I haven't really gone into that. I can imagine that there might be students who feel that there's something embarrassing about talking about their parents' education. I suppose it's going to be about, in part, the kind of society and what it is that we're trying to redress. We're recognizing that there's huge inequalities, there's legacy of educational disadvantage, and we want to fix that. We want to, at the same time, capture the way that race works by creating that disadvantage without requiring race classification at every turn. And we think that the hybrid model gets us closer to it.
Okay, so it turns out that there's not a class actually. So if the Vice-Chancellor is okay to take another round of questions, let's have them. Okay, so you can have your second turn now. Okay?
My second question was that how do you guys deal, because it almost seems like the admissions people are underqualified to deal with things like A-levels and different systems. When I was applying, I was told my grades are good enough, by someone in admissions who I actually realized later was a student. And then when one of my cousins was like taking grades to the dean was like, I'm so sorry, these are excellent grades, I'm so sorry you did A-levels, they don't know what they're talking about. How do you avoid such things? Because it seems like they don't understand the A-level system. Why isn't there a facility where they deal with separate like IB and A-levels and international students? Why isn't it such a, because it seems like they really don't know what they're doing.
Anybody else want a question? Okay, please go again.
Thanks. So my main question here has to do with how much this model is being tested. So obviously it's a much more complicated model than simple race bands. But now, do we know how sensitive it is to year just random fluctuations in performance? Is there enough data there? And if I may quickly follow up the previous question, just based on time. So with band B being primarily a proxy for race, even within a race band of people competing for band B, how can you say necessarily that those particular points mean that this student is more advantaged to this extent? I mean, there must be some quantification of disadvantage to allow a distinction between candidates within that band, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, got that? Anybody else? Okay, thanks.
Do you want to answer the question of the admissions personnel?
No, just to say to you, I'm pretty confident that I know that our people have regular conversations with the Cambridge people, with the international baccalaureate people, and so there's a pretty good understanding of how to calibrate those symbols relative to ours. You may have spoken to somebody who may not understand that, and we'll follow that up. But the requirements that we've got here now are pretty, I think, stable in terms of what it is that we expect from somebody who might come here with A-levels or an IB qualification.
So we're hoping that you were unlucky in the sense of that you encountered someone. But we as I said, we have 17% of our undergraduates are international students. Most of them, of course, have done other school-leaving systems, and so we think we have people trained to cope with that. If you're telling us we don't, we have to go back and try harder and identify where the weaknesses are. But we certainly need to take it seriously. We don't want to admit people who won't cope on the one hand, and we don't want to lose people who would be very good. It's in our interest to get it right. The question of testing, the way this was done was through quite a lot of statistical testing. In other words, we looked at all of these and many other variables that would be indicators of disadvantage, and with multivariate analysis and looking at how strong the coefficients are, comparing that to their performance in the NBTs and also to their performance in first year. And so we did this over several years. In the end, these are statistical, so they're only probabilities. They will not be precise measures. And we also had to lose measures which we wouldn't be able to verify. So an accurate measure would be someone's income, but actually it's very hard to verify income, especially when you're dealing with 25,000 applicants. It's different when you've got 3,000 people applying for financial aid and they're on your campus and you've got enough time to investigate their backgrounds, but when you have 25,000 applicants, you can't do that sort of investigation into their financial circumstances. So we have not used indicators that look like they would be too unverifiable. And we will monitor it each year, and there probably will be changes. But the two or three big factors we think are strong indicators, and they cover the rest. The school, it's clear. If you come from, the schools are arranged by deciles, or in fact by 5 percentile groups. Anything below the 70th percentile is a really weak school, and you get the maximum 10 points. And between that and a 10 and a top school, you get from 10 down to 0. And that's quite robust. And that accounts for the vast majority of the disadvantaged students that we pick up. The next biggest group are those who are going to good schools and not getting that, are benefiting from parental education. And there's both a plausible intuitive link, a link from international literature about the importance of those variables, and a link from our own statistics. But in fact, the maximum points you can get out of 10 is 3 for parents' education, according to the statistical modeling we did. Language is significant. If you've been brought up speaking a language or your parents speak a language that's different from the language of your schooling, and there's a clear impact on your educational performance. And so that's another factor, and that weighs quite heavily. It's really that, so I think there will be weaknesses, but actually in the scheme of things, I don't think that it will undermine the system, A bigger problem, which often comes up in these question and answer sessions, is verifying parents' education. So when someone says to us, my parents left school and then didn't have any other education, how do we check that? Because you've got to somehow prove a negative. Very difficult to do. And what we'll be doing is, where that's a relevant factor, or where we think there's any measure of suspicion, we now think from testing this, that almost anyone who has a profession, who has a degree, because that's the measure, has an internet presence somewhere. And so by Googling people, we will pick up what their jobs are, what degrees they have. They'll be on LinkedIn, they'll be on Facebook. They would have to go to a lot of trouble to eliminate their internet presence if they wanted to hide that sort of information. You know, people are alumni of universities. Most universities have databases of alumni which are on the internet, and Google it and things come up. So there will be some that get through, but we will have warnings on our application forms that say, if you lie about this, as we have at the moment, then we reserve the right to withdraw the offer and not to let you back into the university.
Okay. Sensitivity of the model.
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
So you can overfit a model by using particular data to the randomness in that particular data. So from year to year, are we trying to overfit the model without having tested it over enough years? I mean, how many years has been tested on, basically?
Okay, we tested it for 3. We tested data. We accumulated data for 3 years. And we tested the years separately, and we tested them together because sometimes the numbers weren't big enough. But because we're only accounting for about 56% of the variability in performance with these measures of disadvantage, I don't think we would be overfitting, as we're not really accounting for all of it, only 56% of the variability.
I'd like to say that also just to say putting a blanket race classification would also be unfair in the sense that there are quite a number of African students who may be classified as black from other countries elsewhere in Africa who have maybe acquired South African citizenship. And if those people apply to UCT, then they'll just be classified as black, but they are not really necessarily, have been disadvantaged by the apartheid system. So, I think.
Thank you for that point. You're highlighting another change that was made, but it's not related to this policy, which was actually being made for this year. And that was the change in the question of how you classify yourself. Previously, the question was, would you classify yourself coloured, Indian, African, white in terms of the apartheid categories? And that raised the problem you highlight, plus many others. The question has been changed to say, and also it made it impossible for us to verify, because, as I said earlier, if someone said they were black, we just have to accept that. We don't have any basis for disputing it. The new policy, the new phrasing of the question, is not a change in the policy, the question has changed. And the question now says, how was your mother classified under apartheid, and how was your father classified under apartheid? So this is now a factual thing, because if your parents lived in South Africa and you were, and they were born before 1987, which they must have been if you were born around 1994 afterwards, then they would have been subject to the race classification policy. They would have birth certificates which would have a race classification, they would have ID books, etc. So there's a verifiable fact which was determined by the apartheid regime, how each parent was classified. If you had a parent, if one of your parents was from overseas, then they wouldn't have been classified, and then you would say there would be a blank thing saying not classified. And so the redress categories, the redress would only apply to people who had at least one parent classified under apartheid in one of those categories.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor.
Okay. Thank you for coming.